Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Learning Israel webinar program. I'm your host, Rabbi Ari Enkin, coming to you live from Beit Shemesh, Israel. Tonight is Wednesday, history class, December 23rd, 2015. As we do each and every class, please sign in, everyone. Let me know that you're there. Give me your name, maybe where you're listening in from, and please confirm with me that you hear me okay and that you see the first slide, which says the Israel Journey Jewish History class with a picture of yours truly. Sign in, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll get started in just a moment. I see that in Hungary, they hear me just fine, and in Salt Lake City, welcome. Okay, so they hear me okay in Germany and Texas and Salt Lake City and Hungary. I guess we're doing well. Welcome from Canada. John, I always love the Canadians in my classes. Can't help but to remember the old country. That's where I'm from, Canada, home and native land. Welcome, Christy and Cheryl and John and Patty. We'll get started in just a moment. We have some people logging in just now. We call them slowpokes. That's what we call them. We'll just give them another second or two. And welcome, Rivka. Welcome to the program. So good to have you on over here. Rivka, I'm friends with those who are listening right now. I'm very friendly with Rivka's family here in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Welcome, Mike from New Jersey. Where do you live, Rivka? If I may, just a moment before we get our program going. Where do you live, Rivka? Let's see if how fast Rivka could type over here. Rivka lives in Muncie. Okay. Fine. Rivka's niece is getting married next week. We wish her a mazel tov. Hopefully, maybe you're coming to the wedding. Mazel tov to Rivka on her niece's wedding next week. Ladies and gentlemen, we're getting started right now. Everyone hears me. Everyone sees me, the slides at least. Let's get going. We are talking about Jewish life in the Middle Ages, and particularly right now, we are talking about Jewish women. Yes, ladies, this class is especially for you, Jewish women in the Middle Ages. You see, the Jewish communities of northern France and Germany, these were the countries, the concentrations of medieval Ashkenaz. Okay, this is the center of Ashkenazi Jewry in the Middle Ages. That's northern France and Germany. And why did the Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, well, the Jews of that time, establish their communities in these places? And the answer to that is because what the Jews did is they established their communities along the trade routes of the time. You see, the Jews were always businessmen, always engaging in trade. So they built their communities where they'd have a lot of business going back and forth. In fact, not only were these communities very well known for their businesses, but the Ashkenazi communities were also very well known for having accomplished scholars and rabbis. So here you have a nation of Jews, a concentration of Jews that can be divided up into two categories, at least from a professional perspective, and that's businessmen and scholars. And these communities with their businessmen and scholars flourished during the Middle Ages, particularly about from the year 1000 to the year 1450. And these centers grew, and Jewish studies and Jewish learning grew, education grew, success grew. There was material growth, there was spiritual growth, there was much success for the Ashkenazi communities at this time. However, a lot of this success and prosperity was halted by the Black Death, also known, if I'm not mistaken, as the bubonic plague, and that was in the 14th century. So from the 1000 till about the 1300s, life was pretty good. There were challenges with the Christian neighbors. We might get into that shortly. But life was pretty good until the Black Plague came around in the 14th century. So together with the prosperity and growth, we see that the Jews of Ashkenaz did have some hard times. The communities along the Rhine River were attacked in the late 11th century by the Crusaders. That was a big blow to Jewish life and prosperity and success. And there were further attacks during the succeeding decades and centuries. But despite these violent incidents, Jewish life did flourish, and Jewish life was happy. Of course, minus a pogrom, crusade, inquisition, Holocaust. But life was essentially good for the Jews of Ashkenaz. But during the early 14th century, there were changes. And the Jews of France were expelled from France in the early 14th century. Many people are under the mistaken impression that Jews were only thrown out of Spain. But no, Jews have been thrown out of Spain and Portugal and England and France. I don't even have to get into the Arab countries that expelled Jews from time to time. But France also expelled their Jews, especially after the Black Death. Many communities in Germany were expelled. And these Jews that were expelled generally moved eastward into Poland and surrounding areas, which is where many of your Ashkenazi friends and neighbors would be descending from. Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary. That's how the Jews got to these places. They generally came from northern France and Germany and moved eastwards when they got kicked out from the various places they lived in. Look at the map on your screen over here. You'll see which areas of Europe and North Africa were Christian lands. It's most of Western Europe, certainly. The Muslim lands were, of course, Northern Africa and the Middle East. You can see the paths of the Crusaders in your blue, green, red, and yellow lines over there. And the Crusaders went through these communities, inflicting pain and death wherever they could. So that is life in northern France, Germany, Crusades, and expulsion. Medieval Jewish society, like all of traditional Jewish culture, was ordered generally by patriarchal hierarchy. Let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, it was a man's world. Not just in Jewish society, make no mistake, but medieval society in general was very male-dominated, male-orientated. Women's position in society was secondary in comparison to that of men. And a variety of comments made in religious and philosophical works attest to this fact, as well as there's documentation that there was a certain degree of misogyny in medieval Jewish culture. There are philosophical, medical, and religious views from that time, from that era, that supported the view that men were superior to women, both in nature and in deeds. I want to make something very clear, is that these man's world domination was not a reflection of Jewish law and belief. It was a reflection of society more than Jewish law, Jewish belief. Yes, many of the Jewish texts are seemingly male-focused, male-dominated, but Judaism very much believes equal but different. We don't believe that one gender is superior to the next gender. We believe in equal but different. There are religions that believe that men are superior, inherently superior. But Judaism does not believe that. Judaism believes that men have different roles to play in the world, in the family. Women have different roles in the world and in the family. And together, it's two halves a whole. If everyone was involved in what we call quote-unquote men's jobs, well, we wouldn't have balance. That's my opinion, at least. I can probably prove it to you from Jewish texts. And if everyone wanted to be like a woman, we probably wouldn't have balance either. Things wouldn't be too successful. We have a healthy family, moral, traditional value that seems to have worked pretty darn good when you look at the outside world today. So I have to say that Judaism should be proud of the roles that it set for men and the roles it set for women. Very proud. Yes, there were times in history that men were superior and women were mistreated. Women got the bad end of the deal. That's true, but does not reflect Judaism's teaching. It reflects society as a whole. But at the same time, one can find many positive comments and documentation, historical records about women's roles. According to these more positive sources, women were admired as God-fearing and true partners of their husbands. Our sages teach us that a good marriage was a blessing that God himself was part of. As scholars of these and other times and places have argued, both positive and negative attitudes existed towards women, and any picture one seeks to create is filled with contradictions. So bottom line is that there is no, at least in my research, listen, I'm a rabbi, not a historian, but in my research, certainly in preparing this program tonight, there is no evidence either way to say that men were superior, to say that women were mistreated. There are schools of thought going both ways, with some schools of thought saying indeed men were superior and women were mistreated, but there are also schools of thought and plenty of documentation to back up the view that Jewish life, family life in medieval times was very happy and healthy and balanced. That's why you have on your screen over here a few nice pictures I gathered together, which are contradictory. Women rule, men rule, women can do it, women rule the men. That's a reflection of my research on this slide, is that there are conflicting and contradictory reports as to Jewish family life in the Middle Ages. Frankly, as we'll see soon, I do believe that women had the rough end of you know what I mean? Women got the beating once in a while, not literal, that's figurative. Women got the bad end of the deal, but we'll find out in a moment, we'll see in just a moment, how the rabbis always looked out for women's welfare and tried to improve their lot whenever possible. If there's any questions at any time, feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer based on what I know. Like I said, I'm a rabbi, not a historian, but I do enjoy this class Wednesday nights. I do enjoy researching and preparing the class for you. Let's go on to our next slide. To a large extent, more about medieval Jewish women, to a large extent, our knowledge on medieval Jewish women, women's life, depends on the sources that report their deeds. Jewish women appear in many of the Hebrew sources that have survived from the Middle Ages. And scholars who have written and described the lives of women in the Middle Ages have taken advantage of the many different genres that contain information about different aspects of women's life and of attitudes towards women. The most plentiful source material from the Middle Ages in Ashkenaz were, believe it or not, where we get a lot of our information and history on women in the Middle Ages from, believe it or not, we get it from the responsa work. We get it from the books, the holy books of questions and answers that were written by leading rabbinic authorities of the time. This idea of questions and answers continues to this very day. When we have a very difficult question, we send the question to a rabbinic authority, a great senior rabbi, and the rabbi responds. Now, in the questions and in the answers, as you might imagine, there's a lot of details that are given in order to explain the question and details that are given to explain the answer. And we learn so much of Jewish life from the Middle Ages from these responsa, these correspondences between great rabbis and those who ask them the questions. Very fascinating. Many of these questions deal with women and domestic problems, a lot about divorce, inheritance, custody, a woman's involvement in business, in the synagogue, ritual matters, legal matters. This is how we know, this is where we get a feeling from on what women's role and experience was in the Middle Ages from the rabbinic literature. I think this is very cool. because there are very few books out there about Jewish women's experience in the medieval times. Very little out there. But in the rabbinic responsa, you can go very quickly and directly to these issues of the woman's role. These sources provide an outline of what some women were doing in actuality, as well as guidelines to the way legal authorities thought women should behave. All this material, information, facts, details give us an idea on how Jewish life and women's life was during the Middle Ages. Another important source for our knowledge of Jewish life in the Middle Ages is exegeses on the Bible and the Talmud, and even from the liturgy, the prayer books. Many of the commentators, such as the famous scholars in medieval France and Germany, they comment on the women in their times, as well as on the way they understood the lives of women in the past. And this was compared to life at that time. There's also many stories in moral rabbinic literature that illuminate the different aspects of medieval life and beliefs. Other stories from this period, together with medical literature, community lists, other records, provide all kinds of insights and mentalities of medieval Jews and the place women had in that society. Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns, criticism, anything about the response to literature, how we learned so much from the rabbinic works of the time? Okay, no real questions coming in right now. A few nice comments. Happy you're enjoying. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the more intimate details of a woman's role, woman's life, marriage, and family. All Jewish women in medieval Ashkenaz were expected to quickly become wives and mothers at a young age. The option of not marrying was, well, not an option. Jewish society strongly encourages and believes in marriage, even though in the medieval times, the outlying Christian society did look at celibacy as a virtue. There are many in medieval times in the Christian world that chose a life of celibacy. We believe as Jews that marriage is the ideal, and engaging in marriage and procreation and all the benefits that come with marriage is an ideal way to serve God, whereas many in the Christian world believed that marriage was just an excuse to give in to our natural desires. I guess that is true. Marriage is a way that lets us give in to our natural desires for intimacy, for sexual relations. But Judaism teaches, my friends, that that is all holy. Giving in to your desires or enjoying your desires through marriage is something praiseworthy and holy, and marriage is considered very sacred in Judaism and Jewish life and Jewish thought. And to this very day, being celibate is frowned upon, to say the least. All Jewish men and women are expected to get married. If you can't find a spouse, you can't find a spouse. But as a general rule, celibacy is not an option from the perspective of Jewish thought. Women were often promised by their fathers or other relatives in early childhood. Yes, they made marriages or matches, commitments at a very, very young age. And they would be registered and committed to one another from a very young age, with engagements often taking place at about 12 years old. Official engagements and even marriages would take place at 12 years old, but sometimes as early as 3 and certainly 9. The commitments, the matches, the shidduchim as we call it, would be made and ready and waiting for the bride and groom to grow up. A woman who was not married by 12 years old was in some areas at some periods of time looked down upon. But nevertheless, she always had the right to refuse the man who was chosen for her. And that's very important. There's a misconception that Judaism believes in blind marriages. That's not true, even though there are similar ideas in ultra-Orthodox circles and Hasidic circles. Even the Hasidim will tell you that it's forbidden to get married without the agreement of both parties and without, at the very least, one date. Yes, many Hasidic Jews get married after one date or get engaged after one date, But that being said, they will agree and confirm that there's no such thing as getting married sight unseen and with full consent between the two parties. But nevertheless, even though a woman could refuse the groom that was chosen for her at a very young age, the sources seem to indicate that very few women ever refused these matches. These matches went through to marriage and lived often, but not always, happily ever after. Canceling an agreement made by two families was actually considered very, very severe, frowned upon, and in some situations even unforgivable, since people were afraid that the harm, the bad name, the gossip that would spread due to having canceled the marriage, canceled the engagement, would make future matchmaking very difficult. And that continues till this very day. Breaking an engagement in today's Orthodox society, and I say that's from the Orthodox world of all stripes and perspectives, from the ultra-Orthodox to the modern Orthodox, canceling an engagement is a very grave thing, very much frowned upon. And in the more Orthodox circles, one who breaks an engagement is required to secure for himself a letter of forgiveness or of consent to the broken engagement in order to get remarried, re-engaged. So breaking an engagement is a very, very serious thing. Some rabbis even said, I don't think it's too literal, maybe it's figurative, but some rabbis have been known to say, better to get married and then divorce rather than to break an engagement. So obviously I wouldn't rely on that teaching for practical purposes, but it gives you an idea of how serious breaking an engagement really is. And again, when an engagement is broken, that's only natural. People ask questions. Why was it broken? What did they find out? What they know now that they didn't know before? Etc., etc. Couples that married at a young age often lived with the parents of the bride or the groom for the first year or two after marriage, free room and board. In this way, the groom could continue his studies. That was very common back then, that they would study Torah studies, excuse me, and while the husband, the new young husband, would be pursuing some rabbinic studies, some high-level Jewish studies, the couple could be supported at the beginning of their married life. So the first 2 years, they would have, like I mentioned, room and board and a lot of support. Parents provided their daughters with dowries, and the quality of the match depended on the size of the dowry. The rich families, the rich girls got to marry the top boys. The poor girls who didn't have a dowry married, well, the boys that were left over. That, unfortunately, continues to this very day. The sources suggest that obtaining a sizable dowry and acquiring a respectable match for daughters was a central concern for parents right from the cradle, and that too is true today. As Brian is commenting over here, wow, all of this is so different by today's standards, especially here in America. Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of American standards or which way things are going, but in the Orthodox world, unfortunately, some of this stupidity and pettiness continues to this very day. The rich boys and girls looking only for rich boys and girls, and the poor boys and girls only marrying poor boys and girls. And that's unfortunately the way society often conducts itself. Any other questions? Okay, let's go on to our next slide. Despite the continued Talmudic tradition that served as the basis of all medieval Jewish marriage practices and customs, some of the principles around which medieval marriages were arranged began to change in the Middle Ages. And the first and most central change, the very famous change, was implemented during the First Crusade era, is as follows. There was a great rabbi named Rabbeinu Gershom, or Rabbeinu Gershom ben Judah Meor Hagola, and he established two statutes with regards to marriage. The first is a ban on bigamy. You were not allowed to marry more than one wife. Until then, the year 1000 approximately, a Jewish man, was permitted to take more than one wife. Rabbeinu Gershom put an end to that. And the other change that Rabbeinu Gershom put into marital life, to the benefit of a woman, was the ban on a man divorcing his wife against her will. Yes, until the year 1000, according to biblical law, a man could wake up one morning and say, I don't want to be married to you anymore. Here's your get, here's your divorce, get out. You get it? Get out. A divorce in Judaism is called a get, G-E-T. So until the year 1000, which is consistent with biblical law, a man could get up one morning and divorce his wife against her will. Rabbeinu Gershom, one of the greatest rabbinic authorities of all time, not to mention the greatest rabbinic authority of that time, but he continues to be the greatest rabbinic authority of all time to some extent. So he decreed that you may not divorce a woman against her will, you must have her consent before divorcing her. And that, of course, was meant to be for the benefit of Jewish women, so they wouldn't find themselves without room and board, without shelter from one day to the next. It's unclear, however, how many polygamous marriages there were in Ashkenazi society. Even though it was permitted, it seems that by the early Middle Ages, it was almost unheard of in Western Europe, amongst Jewish communities in Western Europe, to have more than one wife. But after the ban was created and enacted by Rabbeinu Gershom, it became more and more enforced. At first, it was not implemented in cases in which the couple did not have any children. That's right. In the olden days, if you were married 10 years without children, a man was allowed to take a second wife in order to have children. Because according to Jewish law, you have to have kids. If you can't have kids, you have to find a new wife. So a man would marry another woman if he had no kids. Why 10 years? Anybody, any guesses as to why Jewish law says a man must wait 10 years before taking a second wife to have children? Anyone know where 10 years comes from? Any guesses out there? Let's see who's the first to get the right answer. Why does Jewish law say that you must wait 10 years before divorcing your wife in order to marry somebody else to have children, or before taking a new wife to have kids? And the answer is, we get that from Sarah and Avraham. Sarah and Avraham Avinu didn't have children for the first 10 years of their marriage, or at least 10 years after living in the land of Israel, to be exact. So that's where 10 years comes from. But even today, though, if you don't have children, you still cannot take another woman. Though there are those who choose to divorce and then remarry in order to have children. But Rabbi Gershom's ban on taking a second wife applies even in the case, even for the sake of having children, it remains forbidden. It remains forbidden. You would have to divorce your wife and marry a new one to have kids. Okay. After the 12th century, Rabbeinu Gershom's enactments were more strictly enforced, and even in cases where the woman was barren, the husband could remarry only after he divorced his wife. So we see that monogamy is very, very important in Jewish life, especially from the year 1000. Here's something cool for you. Here's something cool to think about. Rabbeinu Gershom was a rabbi in Ashkenaz. He was a leader of the Jews of Ashkenaz, which, you might have guessed it, the Jews of Sephardic lands, the Sephardic Jews, never accepted Rabbeinu Gershom's enactment, never accepted Rabbeinu Gershom's ban on marrying more than one wife. And that's why in Sephardic countries, they had multiple wives even into the 21st century. In fact, when Yemenite Jews came to Israel in 1948 and the 60s, they often came with more than one wife, because the Jews of Yemen never accepted Rabbeinu Gershom's enactment of only having one wife. And just like the Arab Muslim societies permitted taking more than one wife, especially in Yemen, so too the Jews naturally took more than one wife because it's biblically permissible, and Rabbeinu Gershom was not an authority for Sephardic or Yemenite Jews, and therefore his enactments did not apply to them. In the state of Israel today, the general consensus is it is forbidden to marry another wife, even if you're Sephardic. Let's go on to our next slide. While it is hard to determine the extent to which the ban against bigamy influenced the Ashkenazi society, it is certain that Rabbeinu Gershom's second ban was highly influential. that ban against divorcing a woman against her will. Divorce was not a rare occurrence in medieval Jewish society. In fact, scholars seem to suggest that divorce was actually quite widespread. Even one-third, yes, scholars say that one-third of Jewish marriages often ended in divorce. Why? Why? The high divorce rate was probably the result of marriage at a young age. So too, there was a strong social stigma against breaking engagement agreements, as we spoke about a moment ago. So perhaps because of this, there was a high rate of divorce, and legal authorities, the rabbis, tried to make it more difficult for women to be divorced from their husbands. So, yeah, wow. Wow, another wow coming in. Lots of divorce in the Middle Ages because people were married, committed at a young age. People were scared to break off these matches that were made, and they went through with them. Sometimes they worked, and sometimes they didn't. Let's go on to our next slide. More about the marriage rules of the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, one will note changes that were essential to understanding medieval marriages and economics. During the pre-Crusade period, the family of the bride usually provided a dowry, whereas the family of the groom promised money in the future, most notably in the form of inheritance that the son would eventually receive upon the passing of his parents. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the emergence of new strategies of marriage negotiations in Ashkenazi society. Until the mid-13th century, only the woman's family put up money before the marriage took place. Whereas the groom's family, again, committed itself to funding by way of the ketubah, the marriage document, which essentially promises a woman an amount of money upon death or divorce from the husband. A new ruling that originated in the 12th century enhanced the position of the bride's family. How so? Whereas previously, once the marriage was contracted, the money was transferred to the husband's family and no longer returned to the bride's family, even if the bride died, say, the day after the wedding. That was all changed. So once again, that was changed. When a woman gave dowry money, when a woman's family, the bride's family, gave dowry money to the groom, it became the groom's no matter what, even if the bride would die the next day. But the rabbis made another rule, again, to protect women, that the bride passed away within the first 2 years of marriage, and there were no children born to the couple, the money was returned to the bride's family. This is an enactment that applies even today, in our day and age. This enactment is in the Code of Jewish Law. So it's very important, and we see, yet this is the third or fourth item that we've learned this evening that rabbis enacted for the benefit of the women. Now, once a couple was married, the focus moved to having kids. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage. So once the pressure of marriage was off, the pressure on having children was on. Children were expected in every marriage, and they were to be the main focus of every woman's life. The care of young children was, of course, even today, given to the woman. Mainly, it's the mommy that raises the children. We find in medieval literature, historical documents, barren women were often miserable. They were second class. They were looked down upon. They were social outcasts. And to some extent, that applies even today. We find that today, that in certain Orthodox circles, women who are barren are simply not in the clique. Many women turn to all kinds of good luck charms and amulets and talismans in order to get children, to get pregnant. Although couples often married young, it seems that they either refrained from sexual relations until the woman was old enough to deliver a child safely, or they used some form of contraception. I'm sure you'll agree that if you're getting married at 12 or 13, it wouldn't be wise to have children right away. So again, there was contraception or complete abstinence. We see gynecological documentation refer to the age of 14 as an age where it was still too narrow to have a child safely. So before 14, they didn't have children. And women were taught, midwives would instruct young women in contraception and when pregnancy came, on how to deliver. The average number of surviving children of women in medieval Ashkenaz has been estimated between 2 and 4. And this conclusion is based on lists of Jews killed during the Crusades and on the biographies of some of the well-known scholars of the period. Unfortunately, there's no other demographic evidence, but we do believe that the average family was 2 to 4 children during this time. In any case, even if we accept this opinion, it is probable that most women delivered many more than 2 or 4 children because infant mortality was so high, it's likely that women gave birth to 5, 6, and maybe up to 10 children, but many would die in infancy, even at childbirth. That was life in medieval times. I'm getting asked right now what was with genetic defects. Brian, I didn't come across any type of documentation to share with you this evening on genetic defects in the Ashkenazi Jews in the medieval period. But indeed, on that note, there are quite a number of genetic diseases, defects that Ashkenazi Jews are known to carry. The most famous of them is the Tay-Sachs genetic disorder, in which case if both parents are carriers of Tay-Sachs, a child would often die before the age of 2. Today, in Israel, all teenagers get tested for these genetic diseases, genetic defects. All Ashkenazi Jews, certainly. A special service in Israel. There's like a system in Israel where you get tested, you take a blood test, you're given a number, and when you go on dates, you would call in your number with your girlfriend's number or boyfriend's number, and you would be told if your 2 numbers are a match, meaning there would be no genetic defects should you decide to get married and have children. That is what's done today. It's called the Dor Yesharim program. Dor, D-O-R, Yesharim program. And I too did it when I was dating, took the blood test, and when my wife and I went on a date, we would just call in the 2 numbers, and they would say, yes, these 2 numbers can marry. I'm being told that you have that in the US as well. Okay, that's cool. Let's go to our next slide. Women were expected to care for the young children, and that the responsibility for children, especially for boys, was transferred to their father when school would begin. As it says in the Torah, the men are responsible to teach the children, to ensure the children are educated. But that was generally only for the boys. Women were responsible for their daughters' education because women would often be homeschooled, whereas the boys would be sent to the cheder, the Jewish school, the Torah school, to study the Bible, to study the Talmud, to study all kinds of Jewish studies. The female involvement in the upbringing of the daughters is also reflected clearly in legislation concerning laws of custody. According to Jewish law, daughters always remained in the custody of their mothers, whereas sons were transferred to their fathers once they reached the age of education, because again, fathers are responsible for educating their children, their sons. If a woman survived childbirth, get this, she had a good chance of living into her 60s. The early age of marriage, at times marriage to an older spouse, and women's longevity, in comparison to men's, caused widowed women to be a commonplace in medieval society. There were many widowed women. Widows were in a unique position since they were not under the authority of any man. And like divorcees whose ex-husbands were still alive, they were independent. In some cases, widows actually had substantial capital and wealth to live off and to conduct their businesses because they would have, of course, inherit their husband's estate. The fact that widows in medieval Europe benefited from a relative social and economic independence has led some scholars to argue that the status of a widow was actually somewhat favorable and not necessarily behind the 8 ball, the black ball, however that expression goes. Yet widowhood was not a simple position for women. Sources indicate that widows, especially widows with young children who were probably also young themselves, were usually interested in getting married again, and at times quite rapidly. In addition, the families of younger widows were often uncomfortable with the idea that their daughters, who were very eligible and often very attractive, would remain unmarried. And a certain degree of suspicion and fear of sexual promiscuity accompanied this status, which is why, again, many women would get married early in order to do away with any fears of sexual promiscuity, which is very frowned upon both from a halachic Jewish perspective as well as society and social perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation this evening on the woman's status in medieval ages. We will continue this discussion next Wednesday with more on women's status and life in medieval ages. Before we go, I'm going to leave you with some musical accompaniment. And on that note, I'll take this opportunity to thank you for coming this evening. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. See you again next week. Shalom ulehitraot.
שהוא מוידד לו בכל מידו ומידו שהוא מוידד לו ומוידד לו בכל מידו ומידו שהוא מוידד לו בכל מידו ומידו שהוא מוידד לו ומוידד לו yo